you may have a horrid death then in an intensive care unit. And a good death is when you can actually choose your death, choose what you want. So the first thing then is you must obviously read the book and learn what's likely to happen so that you don't go into death unprepared. And then the death process starts. You go to a hospice, and the first parts of the death process are healing. As one of our people said, death is not a great experience, but it is a healing experience. The first part of a good death is that you want to get all your relationships right. If you've been fighting with your son, then the atmosphere in the room where you're dying is conducive to the mending of rifts. So the first part of a good death, then, is the healing of rifts, the settling and visiting those parts of your life that you're not happy or weren't happy with, and coming to terms with them. Then the next part is to be surrounded by people who you love. And the idea of dying again in an intensive care unit alone is really a horrid thought when you can be surrounded by those who you love. Of course, not all of us can do that.
Right.
But in this country, we're getting much closer to it. And if you die of cancer, now you can, because Macmillan nurses come to your home and help support you and look after you at home as you die. So that is wonderful. And then once your relationships have been sorted out and you've got your life in order, then you will go into the final week of death, and then you'll get your visitors who come and pick you up. So that, I think, is a good death.
I think that is, in chaplaincy, when I was doing a rotation as a hospital chaplain,
yeah,
I learned this particular exchange, which we would often teach to siblings of somebody who is passing on, especially if there were hard feelings between the generations. And we would always say that you should offer to the dying your forgiveness and ask for their forgiveness for anything that you did that disappointed them, even if it's disproportionately, it was an abusive father or somebody. If you want to bury the hatchet with the dad, then you say, I just want to let you know, I forgive you for anything you did, and I hope you forgive me too. And it sets the table for the other person who may not be inclined to ask for forgiveness to take that and to work more in that area. And it really, it works. It's very effective, I think. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that is so wise. And that's the most wonderful thing that you said there, because this, after all, is what dying is about. It is, in fact, forgiveness. It is reconciliation.
Yeah.
It is coming to terms, and that's exactly what you should do. I think the other thing that one has to remember, that although it's nice to be surrounded by the family, a lot of people choose to die alone, and this is a positive choice. And if only we could discuss these things. You see, what we've done in our culture is push death way, way away. In fact, if you're born, you die, and so it's all part of the cycle. And I think what we need to do is to understand it. And we need to ask the dying person, possibly before they get that close, do you want to die alone? Do you want us to be here when you die?
Right.
Because there is a moment when the dying person can voluntarily decide to hold on to life or to let go. And some people want to die alone. They actually don't want to die in front of the family. So they always choose a moment when the family are out of the room just to let go and die. So you have some control at the last moment.
And so that's a good death. Let's talk a little bit about a bad death, at least in one sense, maybe some under circumstances of violence or fear. And do we know as much about, like, say, battlefield visions or people who are, caught in an accident? Did you collect any stories from people who were not at peace or in hospice at the time?
Yes, we did. The model that we have for the violent death ones, the car accidents, the sudden death ones, are the cardiac arrest model, because there the heart suddenly stops, and then they go through the near-death experience, or 10% of them do, which I've described. So we think that to some extent covers the sudden death. But the other half of your question is a really interesting one. Do some people have horrid deaths? Do they go through a spiritual agony before they die? And this is well recognized by care workers, that some people do become very restless, and it's called terminal restlessness. Now, the usual way to deal with terminal restlessness is to sedate people more, and maybe that's fine. But there is a feeling now that terminal restlessness is related to spiritual anxiety, spiritual difficulties. In other words, because you haven't come to terms with your life, with the people around you, then you are really very disturbed. And again, it's the discussion in the last week or few weeks of life that make this terminal restlessness much less likely to occur. So, again, it's an understanding of death and the death process.
The Art of Dying, Dr. Peter Fenwick is our guest. He's the co-author of the book along with his wife, and we will open up the phones and start taking calls. And don't worry, in big letters on my page right here, it's written animal stories. We'll get to that coming up next. And other seemingly random phenomenon on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So we're going to the phones a little bit early because I know that there's so many people out there that have had these experiences, and we'd like you to share them firsthand with Dr. Peter Fenwick. The Art of Dying. It would be wonderful if this happened to you or it happened within your family. And I say wonderful, meaning not that we wish that you have gone through a death experience, but that if you had, it would be like this one. It would be reassuring. It would come with a post-life communication. It would come with reassurances. It would come with that warm, glowing light of compassion that we've been talking about. So if you've got something like that and you want to share that, you want to explore something that you went through, perhaps just like we were talking about, and we'll get to next, something with a pet or something that you've never been quite able to understand. You might get a similar story or two in the book, The Art of Dying, and next with Dr. Peter Fenwick on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So let's just hang on to where we are with those animal stories. But first, let's go east to the Rockies, where Lisa was the first one to get through in Florida on Coast to Coast AM for Dr. Peter Fenwick. Lisa?
Hi, Ian. I have had these circumstances happen to me. Back in the year 1996 and before then, I do a lot of genealogy. And I've often had people tell me that usually their ancestor would pass after reporting that they had seen a family member or like a grandparent or whatever. And about July of 96, I started to feel that something was wrong with my grandmother, that she might pass soon, just from the way that I kept having this feeling. And every night I would just dread leaving her because I just didn't want to stand the thought of her passing and nobody being there with her. And one night I had taken her dinner and she told me, she said, your grandpa appeared in my living room last night. And I said, he did? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, what did he tell you? And he said, honey, it's time to come home. And I slipped because I started crying, and I was really upset because I knew what she was telling me. And the months passed on. It got to be October of 96, and she called me one morning telling me she was feeling bad. And I took her to the hospital, and things seemed to be fine, and they were going to just perform some routine tests. I had gone to take my son home, and I got a frantic phone call from my sister telling me something was wrong. with my grandmother, and she put the phone up to my grandmother's ear long enough to tell me that she loved me. And by the time I made it to